Well, good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar. Thank you for joining us. Today's topic is financial services for Baptist churches. I'm really delighted to, I'm Richard Wilson, the support services team leader here at the Baptist Union. I lead one of the specialist teams here based out of Baptist House. But I'm delighted to be joined by Neil Poynton. Neil Poynton, who is head of charities at Charities Aid Foundation, or CAF. I'll just let Neil introduce himself and CAF.
Thanks, Richard. Good afternoon, all. Thanks very much for giving me the opportunity actually to talk about some financial services, a little bit about what CAF does. I'll keep that fairly brief. Up on the slide, it really gives you sort of the slogan of what CAF really stands for these days, which is, yes, we are a charity which is owned by the foundation itself, but pretty much we're looking to champion the sector and those that operate within what is truly a fantastic sector. So that includes donors, companies and charities, and trying to maximise the impacts that they have on the ultimate beneficiaries. We remain independent, so we're what we would call cause neutrality, which means that any not-for-profit charity, church, independent school, we're very happy to talk to and just try and assist in some way. A little bit about myself. For those of you unfortunate enough to have perhaps met me, I apologise. If you haven't, this is a little bit more about what I am. 30 odd years in the financial and third sectors, doing a range of, I guess, predominantly banking, but a lot of more nuanced areas, including landed estates, businesses in Lloyd's of London insurance into those types of business entities, and of course charities. What I would say from a CAF perspective, don't worry if you know us from just a bank or from the foundation. That's often the case, so hopefully this will give you a little bit more flavour to what we do.
Okay, thank you, Neil. Before we go on, can you just explain the term third sector? Some of our listeners may not have heard that.
It's a very good point. It's probably one of those jargon words that we've fallen into at CAF, but third sector for us is essentially the charitable environment. And that's globally. So CAF itself, we're fortunate enough to have some global offices, not necessarily doing all that we do in London and Kent, but the idea is to really motivate society to give more. So crudely, what we do is we try to connect those that want to give to those beneficiaries that need it most.
Great. So let me just give you an outline of what we're going to talk about today. We're just going to do an introduction in a minute. We will then talk about current accounts and what sort of things to look out for, payment cards for ministers and other staff, taking card payments becoming an increasing topic for churches, savings accounts, something that's been around a long time, borrowing, so churches often want to borrow money for a building or other project. Investments, if you have excess funds that you want to get a return on, and we'll touch briefly on insurance. So those are the topics we're going to cover. If you've got questions, feel free to, and then we will do a wrap up at the end. If you've got questions, do feel free to submit them via the Q&A pane, which will probably appear on the right hand side of your screen in the web browser that you're watching this video on. In some browsers it may appear on the bottom of the screen, so do take a look for that. And if you've got any questions, please do submit them via the Q&A. We'll keep an eye on that feed and try and answer them as appropriate. So why are we doing this particular webinar? Well, churches do have a unique profile. They're relatively small entities in financial terms, but are often employers. They're largely volunteer run. They're not profit-seeking businesses, but rather charities, and mostly funded by donations rather than sales or fees or charges. And most are not registered charities currently, at least, do need to meet good governance requirements and potentially can be under some scrutiny from your local community. So that creates some challenges. My experience, certainly as a church treasurer myself, is the churches as a market are not necessarily very well served by financial services industry. There's often a limited range of options. Some providers try to serve with products that are really designed for small businesses, or what are called CASCs, Community Association Sports Clubs. So they're sort of almost charities, but not quite, or not quite in the same way. This can cause us some challenges. Before we get into the rest of the webinar, I do want to put a health warning on the front of this. We are mentioning products only for information purposes. We're not making recommendations of financial products and services. You must check any products that you buy is suitable for your specific needs. So this is very much a generic for information presentation, and we will try to talk about some of the features that you might want to look out for, and we will mention some specific products. So CAF will talk a bit about some of the products that they offer, but we as the Baptist Union are not making recommendations of any products. This is just to help you think through the issues you need when you're selecting the services, the financial services that you need. So Neil's going to take the lead talking about current accounts.
Thanks, Richard. Yeah, I think to start off with the theme that I'll try to adopt, first of all, primarily and most importantly, that this isn't about positioning CAF products per se, it's really about positioning the concepts of current account, savings and investments and borrowing. So more holistic look at what these things should entail, hopefully to serve in the best way possible for you. So what do we mean by larder? Well, a larder fridge freezer approach, larder is very much current account. So in other words, that cash flow, the day-to-day management of what the individual charity or church needs to undertake. There's a great quote from the ex-founder and CEO of Dell Technologies, Michael Dell, where he essentially says, we were for so long had the foot on the throttle, we forgot to check we were running out of gas. And that gas in this term is really the cash flow day-to-day piece. So from a current account point of view, things to consider, security and wrapping your account as tightly as possible is incredibly important for charities, and indeed anyone if you consider your own personal account. So dual authorization, have a look to see if that's in place for that respective account. What it essentially means is two people are needed to make transactions of importance. Online banking, features and functionality. If I'm honest, some charities need very basic online functions and it suits them well. Others will want particularly sophisticated positions. Try to look at an account that suits your needs. They're very nuanced. Don't necessarily take off the shelf, see what you can achieve. Clearly, from a church point of view, cash deposits are important, and the collection that is taken on a weekly basis, and therefore what do you do with those cash deposits? So make sure from a branch network positioning, you're familiar with how that mechanism works, whether it be a local high street bank that's close to you. From a CAF perspective, I'll be absolutely honest, there are challenges because we're not a clearing bank, therefore we use HSBC. And sometimes we have the vagrancies of what HSBC do in terms of their branch network. So be aware of those potential challenges. Fees and charges, absolutely goes without saying, incredibly important. And then I guess more subsidiary type of requirement you may have if you pay suppliers or you collect funds in on a regular basis. BACS Bureau is a mechanism for you to do that in volume and actually make it efficient and cost effective for you. International payments, I think we're all aware that moving money globally now from a banking perspective is challenging. Try to, where possible, engage with your bank and provider to create a relationship. It's far easier if they understand what you do and the way you go about the day-to-day and weekly business. Relationship management.
Just on that international payments point, it's probably just worth saying we have seen examples of where churches have had issues with their bank, where banks see them making payments to what would be worrying jurisdictions from a financial regulation perspective. So if you try to send money into Iran or Afghanistan or other countries subject to sanctions, you may well see significant issues, and your bank. We have seen examples of bank accounts being closed down. So just do keep your bank informed of what you're doing if you're doing anything that you think might cause concern. Now, even maybe less worrying countries like Ukraine, for example, can trigger some checks with banks. As a general rule, we as the union would advise that if you're sending money for mission overseas, which is often the purpose of sending money overseas, try to go through a recognised mission agency rather than trying to work directly, because it does save you these hassles, because the mission agencies have spent a lot of effort making sure that they are set up to do that properly and in a transparent way. So BMS World Mission or other mission agencies are often the best way to do that. But as you say, international payments, it can be a necessary requirement, even if it's just for simple IT supply or whatever.
Yeah, absolutely, Richard. And I think you're spot on. Often, I guess, from a client perspective, whichever type of client, if you put that sort of banking hat on and understand why those questions are asked, and would also think ahead of the game, if those are the sorts of operations you have, flag the bank early enough, and once that behavioural pattern's understood, it becomes a lot easier.
Yeah, the financial institutions are very worried about breaching international sanctions, particularly US sanctions, because they can get very heavily fined by the Department of Justice in the US or other US bodies, and even have their banking license withdrawn, which would be catastrophic for them, and they're unlikely to take risks with a church bank account that they feel might get them into that sort of trouble. So just beware on that issue. Anyway, sorry, I interrupted your flow.
No, not at all. Any specific questions on movement of funds internationally, we're happy to take and help provide some sort of guidance what you should expect. Thanks, Richard.
So you talked about relationship management and branch locations as well. So let's look on.
So suppliers of current accounts, this is a really interesting piece, and you mentioned earlier in one of the slides that actually where you are housed within a bank is really important. What we tend to find is the issues are amplified if that particular charity or not-for-profit organisation is housed in what we'd call the SME, the small, medium-sized enterprise market within a bank. What you would then tend to find is you will have off-the-shelf business solutions provided. Now, the difficulty there is often the bank don't actually understand the client, and that's where you'll tend to have problems. Thankfully, at CAF, the only area we deal with is the third sector, inverted commas. So just be a little bit mindful of that. I'm not for 1 minute saying high street banks can't be reputably and in the right place for you. They can, but just make sure where you're housed within their offering. So there are specialist banks, which we'll just highlight in just a moment. There are ourselves. There's of course Charity Bank, Reliance, Triodos, etc. All incredibly great organisations. I guess have a look, see what they offer, see what resonates most with you as an organisation and a church, and feel comfortable that you're in the right relationship.
Well, I personally have had experience of our church was actually put within the large corporate sector within one bank that we've worked with, which actually wasn't too bad because it meant you got the sort of large corporate feature set, but it was a slightly strange experience. So yes, it can. Banks have different approaches to how they handle churches because they don't feel they quite fit into their normal model in any way.
No, not at all. I mean, we're somewhat fortunate. CAF Bank, as an example, is wholly owned by CAF. So we are very used to talking about surplus, not profit. I find a lot of charities have that very unfortunate meeting with their new bank who says, well, what profit do you run? We're not here for profit, here for surplus. I would suggest that's an early warning sign that there's a misunderstanding of why you exist and what you intend to do.
And part of the issue sometimes, for example, I had an experience recently where we were looking at a new bank option and went to HSBC, and they offered as a small business product as a current account, and it didn't have dual authorization because a lot of small business owner-led banks, the business owner does all the authorization. It's them. It's near enough their money, and so they work on the basis of single authorization on everything. And the basic answer was, if you're a church, you can have the account. The account's free, but as soon as you have dual authorization, we can't do that online. You have to do all your banking via the branch and via checkbook, which certainly wasn't practical for our church. It could be for some, but so there are these limitations.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the issues that we play in day out at CAF is just good governance.
Yeah.
Putting the policies, procedures in place all the way through from skill sets that are required to do certain things. But also, if you run a cash program, understand how that looks from a governance point of view.
Yeah.
And we try to just foster a relationship approach. That's the way we feel you get best value and the client gets the best experience.
Yep.
Thanks, Richard.
But I think, sorry, we were just going to say there's also a number of specialist charity banks out there, of which CAF is one, but there are others: Charity Bank, Reliance Bank, Tridos, Unity Trust. These don't necessarily have the same scale as the big high street banks, and sometimes challenges around the branch networks and how you engage with them, particularly around cash handling from a collection. But they do understand the charity market.
Yes, it's in some ways it's a good old-fashioned pros and cons on a piece of paper.
Yeah.
What's the priority? What really matters to us? And then trying to dovetail with the best solution. And you're quite right. The likes of Charity Bank, Triodos, Unity, terrific organisations. However, just like our good selves, there will be occasions where we won't be the best fit.
No, indeed. It's very much horses for courses. It depends what you think your day-to-day banking will look like in terms of volumes of cash, volumes of payments, inbound and outbound, and what works best for your church.
So in terms of CAF offer, it's interesting when new folks join CAF, and we cover a lot of ground of what we do, but from a CAF Bank point of view, I tend to always say, think about what would you want as an individual? What does an individual do? And therefore map it across to what your church, charity is likely to want. Day-to-day banking, the current account, online, and so on. And actually what becomes, I guess, the key drivers is not necessarily the fact that there is an online offering, but what are those nuanced requirements that you truly need, and that pros and cons list. So in terms of charges, so that you're aware, in terms of CAF Bank charges, we have two layers. We have a monthly charge of £5, and then we have what we'd class as a high volume movement charge. Now that relates to large amounts of cash moving through or large amounts of cheques. Generally speaking, you have to be putting through a lot in order to trigger that type of charge. But to give you an example, Richard, we had a charity a couple of years ago that we were secondary banker for, but the reason they were using CAF Bank was we were not charging for them putting through in excess of £100,000 worth of cash a month. Now, the problem was, of course, for us, it was entirely uneconomical to be able to do that. Thankfully, when you sit down and talk to them, they understood. But it was clear that as a secondary banking position, it just didn't really work for either party. So be mindful, but I would suggest that those high volume charges from a CAF Bank point of view probably are not relevant to the churches.
I think very few of our churches would be processing £100,000 cash.
It would be a lovely
cash each one. There may be an odd one out there, but that would surprise me. But yes, obviously the majority of our churches would do well to turn over £100,000 per annum, let alone per month, and certainly not all of that in cheques. So
no, and I think probably more importantly is the access to a UK-based service centre where folks pick up the phone, have a very good understanding of the way churches operate. It's what's in our DNA. So one would hope that for that £5 a month, you have the added value of some understanding back at the base.
Yes, and it's worth saying that actually, when you're talking about a banking market, maybe as consumers we're used to free banking as almost like the the standard proposition and have an expectation of that, potentially with a fee-based account that you might pay for that has premium features and insurances and other things thrown in. It's very much the case that the majority of churches and certainly businesses will pay a fee of some sort for their banking options, and so don't feel that if you're paying a fee of 5, 10, whatever pounds per month, that you're necessarily being ripped off in some sense. We've just had a question come in from Steve. Do the charity banks offer FSCS guarantee, which I think is meaning a guarantee on any deposits up to, I think it's £85,000 is the current level? Yes,
and the answer to that, Steve, is it's a great question. Yes, it is. It is covered. Yeah. So all part of the compensation scheme, which is absolutely right, but it does demand then the ability to think about diversification, which we'll move on to later on.
Certainly if churches have large amounts of cash, you would want to think about spreading that money around to benefit from that guarantee across multiple banks. But yes, I think it's worth checking in any bank you talk to, but I think anybody describing themselves as a bank will almost certainly ought to be in that regulated position and have to offer you that. But you do want to check that any bank you talk to is regulated by the Financial Conduct Authority and the Prudential Regulation Authority are the two key authorities in this space. And if they are, then they have access to the Financial Services Compensation Scheme, which will compensate you for any lost deposits up to £85,000. So that was current accounts. It's a bit of a whiz through, but we'll keep going because there are other products we'd like to talk about. One thing that's increasingly becoming common, we talked a bit about, we've talked about cash banking. Traditionally, large parts of payments of inbound and outbound have been either cash or cheque from churches. It's becoming increasingly important, actually, that people don't carry cash and therefore having card payment as an option. So for example, if you want to order something online, it may be necessary to use a card to do that. And we're just going to talk about some of the options around cards. There are some key things to think about: the balance of convenience and cost versus risk. So there are different types of card. A credit card. Now, one of the things, obviously, with a card is generally you are giving up your dual authorization for that card. So somebody in possession of a credit card can make payments up to the credit limit on the card. A debit card generally gives direct access to the full bank account balance. So if you keep all your cash in a single bank account and you have a debit card on that, whoever holds the debit card basically has access to your full balance, which can be quite high risk, obviously quite convenient because they have access to the full balance. You can have prepaid cards, something I've got some experience of personally, which have proved quite helpful, where you have access to the funds but up to the limited card balance. And I know CAF offer something called a business card, which is a debit and credit card hybrid, and I'll let Neil talk about that in a moment. But it's just worth exploring some of these things. So I've been through this. I'm a church treasurer myself for a relatively average-sized Baptist church. We were having issues because we saw that people were not able to spend money. Some people spend money on their own credit card and claim it back as an expense later. Other people were finding that didn't work for them for whatever reason. And so we've got a small number of our sort of staff and volunteer team who hold prepaid cards that we've done through a company called FairFX. As it turned out, they offered a free charity service at the time, and we've got a few of those cards in circulation. And it does, we load it with a certain amount of money and basically say to the person who's got that card, you can spend up to that. If you need to buy something that's more expensive than that, you will have to come and ask for the card to be loaded with additional cash. That worked for us. Other entities, you might look at credit cards. Credit cards have the advantage that the money, you get to check the bill before anything gets paid, so you get the opportunity to stop a transaction. But they can be difficult and expensive to obtain. There are limited credit card options for small business operations or small well, there's limited options for small business operations and even fewer options for charities like the churches would fall into. So I must admit, when I looked at this market a few years ago, I was unable to find something suitable for our church with a credit card, and a debit card we decided wasn't suitable just due to the risks on the whole bank balance. I think if we'd gone down a debit card route, we'd have been looking at having a secondary bank account that would effectively sort of used as a prepaid card. So that's the things we've looked at. I'll just let Neil talk a bit about the sort of hybrid business card offer that you have.
Yeah. So the screen here, it gives you some of the fundamentals, but Richard's covered eloquently a lot of the different types of card and what they exist for. The CAF Bank Card, the reason it's called a business card, it operates off of the MasterCard platform. Now, I would say the majority of transfers are not subject to any additional fees, but there are on occasions via some merchants where there is a fee applied. Now, that will always be notified to you. So we tend to have very little in the way of clients' concerns around that, because it is flagged and one's aware of it before the transaction moves through. But it would be remiss of me not to highlight the fact that it's potentially not always entirely free of any charges. However, in terms of the direct movement of the funds, it acts like a debit card, so it will sweep immediately, recognise the balance that's available. Richard, I think you're absolutely spot on. There are, in inverted commas, clunky ways around it, opening up a second account, putting some money in and allowing that to operate against the card. Regrettably, I just think it's one of those areas where it's understand the options and then plump for what's best for you as an organisation. In truth, there may never be at this point in time an absolute ideal solution.
No, and you know, I think it's an issue that many organisations deal with. In some ways, having a card payment option is more secure than having potentially doing expenses and reimbursement, because you only have the receipts to go on to say what people spent, and you're always to some degree dealing with stuff after the fact. With a payment card, potentially you can have full visibility of where the spending actually went, because you see the details of the merchant on the statement. But there is no perfect solution here, and I'm just offering you some of the thoughts as to what is available. Another topic that's becoming interesting for churches is about receiving card payments. Again, this is something I've looked at myself with my own church. There are two. I would divide this into two sections. There is something about selling goods or tickets or services. So if you're taking just a payment for a service where there's a charge, this can be relatively simple. There are commercial retail solutions that can work very well if you're running a cafe or a bookstall or whatever in your church. Depending on the volume of transactions you're doing and the style of how you're set up, there are traditional card payment terminals that you'd see in any retail store, in your supermarket, coffee shop, whatever. They're not massively cheap. They will tend to have a monthly rental and then a fee per transaction, a percentage. But they work, they're functional, and they're available from a number of different retailers, different providers, sometimes via just your bank. There are some newer, more flexible options. I've mentioned a few of the brand names there, but I believe there are others as well, which kind of have a very cheap terminal that connects to a smart device, usually a phone or a tablet. And in the Baptist Union, we use those for last year's assembly for payments on the day. They were very effective. So we had a couple of iZettle terminals that cost £20-30, connected them to some iPads that we had available, and they were very quick and easy to take payments on. They have no rental cost, and that's great for us because we were just running a once a year event. Obviously, if you're running if you're running something that is more day in, day out, then it might be more economic to have something with a rental payment. But so receiving card payments is not necessarily difficult, because largely you do at that point look more like a business, and the business type products tend to fit quite well. What's much more complicated, and I think less well served. Oh, sorry, I forgot to allow Kat. Sorry,
No,
Kat,
no,
you were
not
just
at
going to
all.
talk about your product here, Neil. Sorry.
Yeah, in terms of accepting payments, we use WorldPay, which is one of those names that have probably been known for some period of time. But in essence, Richard, you've covered off all of the appropriate points. Any differentiating factors from ourselves to the other providers? Not particularly. It's pretty much a sort of a tried and tested positioning.
What is more complicated, what I was going to say, was just about taking donations via card. Now, I don't know about your church, but I've certainly seen a reduction in our church of the level of cash coming in weekly. People just aren't carrying as much cash as they were. And so we've been experimenting a little bit about taking donations via card payments. So there are some features that you have that are particular when receiving donations. Generally, you would want people to be able to give anonymously. And that means that they need to be able to self-serve at the machine, not something you typically see in a retail type solution. Now we've all come across self-service checkouts, but I'll tell you, if you wanted to buy a self-service checkout for your church, then you better have a very large checkbook, because those are very expensive devices. So the challenge is trying to find a device that has the level of functionality to allow self-service, but without ridiculous price. Because I have to say, we as a church didn't know how much we would be likely to take. We still don't really. We're in very early days in my church. And so you don't desperately want to spend £1,000 on a device that might only take £10 a month. So there are options out there, but that are self-service, but maybe only take a fixed donation amount. So it's like tap to give £5, which is great if somebody wants to give £5. It's not great if somebody wants to give £3.99, or if they want to give £200. It's actually worth knowing that if you have one that only takes £5 at a time, if people keep tapping it repeatedly, eventually the card will block, because it sees that as a potential mistake or error or potentially fraud. So it's not as simple as that. So people, generally, you want the ability to select an amount. So my observation at the moment is the market is relatively immature. There are some quite expensive solutions out there. There are some people actually even focusing on the church and charity giving market. So there's an organisation called Goodbox who developed a giving, a traditional church offering plate that has a contactless terminal in the middle of it. Those are not ridiculously expensive, but they do offer only relatively limited fixed donation amounts. And I think it certainly only goes up to contactless limit of £30, which is better than nothing. But again, these are not perfect solutions yet. I think my general guidance would be watch this space. In terms of what my own church has done, again, you need to look at what options there are out there. We've bought I think it's a SumUp terminal, which we've connected to an old Android tablet that we had available, and put an application on it called Give a Little. And what that little application does, it's available in the Google Play Store. It allows you to set up a front screen that just allows you to tap different donation amounts and even put in a custom amount. So somebody can select an amount of, I want to give £1, or I want to give £30, or I want to give £500, and they put their card in the reader, or tap it if it's contactless amount, and they can just make a payment. The challenge is it's a bit of a solution with wires and chargers and everything. Fortunately, one of our church members built a little case to put it in, so it looks relatively neat. But I'll be honest and say it's a bit of a clunky solution. But for us, it cost us £20 for the card terminal, and we're kind of experimenting to see how much money that takes. And if that does start taking hundreds of pounds, then maybe we will invest in a more sophisticated capability. but yeah, that was our toe in the water. But I have to say, this is a space I am monitoring, and say I've yet to find an ideal solution.
Interestingly, Richard, I think you hit the nail on the head there about watch this space. Only yesterday, via the LinkedIn approach, we had one of our ex-product managers at CAF who's been looking at this particular market and the contactless and the approach that you take. And there's going to be some interesting stuff developing. My positioning with most of my clients and our charities is that think of this in the round, the ability to take money contactless or from a donation point of view. Remember to sort of dovetail with your web presence, what you want that to look like, and really adopt a strategy to deliver and seek what you want. And generally speaking, a well sort of laid out plan lets you narrow down the options going forward.
Well, I think it's important to work out the features that you're looking for and see if any solution. Yeah, at the moment, as I say, I don't think I've seen a solution that I go, oh yes, that's exactly what I want, or exactly what my church wants. I've found solutions that kind of fill some, but not necessarily all of the requirements. So, but yes, I would not be surprised if 2 or 3 years down the line we find there is a really good solution out there. Because the church market, there's probably not tens of thousands of churches in the UK or other religious organisations that would be looking to replace their cash collections as that dwindles. So
absolutely.
So on to savings
accounts. Yeah, I mean, I mentioned earlier about the concept of the larder, fridge, freezer. This is really where we're moving into the fridge. So in other words, those funds you don't necessarily need tomorrow, but there might be a what if. What if this happens? I need some access. So classically, we're talking about notice accounts and moving forward from there. I'd say at this point in time, it's not really looking at that longer term investment piece, which we'll move on to later. So key considerations, interest rate, absolutely. There's a fiduciary duty to do the right thing. Terms, yes, instant access, notice, fixed term. I think we're all patently aware at the moment that instant access is very difficult to drive a return above inflation, but do take a look at that. Look for the notice and fixed term positions to absolutely try and outstrip inflation. That's where you need it to move. Security, I think it was Steve asked the question earlier about the FSCS. Yes, do take into account that position and the diversification, minimisation of risk. Moving on from there is the ethical issues. I think quite rightly, as a global society, we're now considering ethics and ethical positioning far more frequently, and long may that continue. I think that's an incredibly healthy state of affairs. So when looking at savings account, what we mean by ethical issues are if you specifically have a governance strategy that would not invest long-term with a particular entity, consider short-term as well. Do you want that ethical positioning to reflect that? And think about one's own ethics of the way you approach these things. One person's, I guess, sustainability is not like another's.
And this is quite a complex area in financial services.
Very much.
Because it's one thing if you buy a share in, say, a tobacco company, that many churches wouldn't do that. But for example, if you're depositing money with a bank, then they will tend to take that money and lend it to somebody else. That's how they make their return. And then you have very limited control and certainly limited visibility of where that money goes. And there are lots of options you might want to think about as to what you and your church might consider unethical places that could end up. So building housing, but probably okay, but what happens if it builds a factory that then gets used for tobacco manufacturing? Is that okay? And then so this is a very complex area, and I think we could hold a sort of multi-day seminar on this topic and probably still not cover it fully. So I think we'll skip over today.
I think it's safe to move on.
You might just want to think about that.
The last point is there are multi-treasury management solutions. It's a long, convoluted way of saying that actually when you have a large amount of money, those providers will tend to be able to make a more bespoke type of arrangement for you and create returns that potentially you wouldn't get from one line of savings positioning. What I would say is that's quite difficult to get hold of. The provider tends to want their pound of flesh and the return on it. But they are out there, and be mindful if I'm particularly mindful of charities who suddenly their positioning changes, a legacy arrives for a huge amount of money. Consider new options. Never be satisfied necessarily you've always got the best option.
What sort of amount of money would you think was necessary to make that worth thinking about?
So I think you are probably talking in the £1 million plus.
Right.
From an investment point of view, 5 years plus. There is a lot of noise in the investment management market that says there is an unloved level of around the £500,000 mark. Now that's a substantial amount of money. So it's quite sad that it's an unloved part of the sector, but put the toe in the water and test and make sure you're getting the best deals.
Okay. So just talk about, so many of you will already be aware that as Baptist Together we do offer a deposit account. I should emphasise this is not covered by the Financial Services Compensation Scheme. That is the nature of the offer. We've got a bit over £50 million deposited by Baptist organisations. It's only available to member organisations of Baptist Together. And we can promise you that all the money is then used for Baptist causes. So if ethical concerns are strong with you, then we can give you a very strong ethical position from this account. But if security is very important to you, then we can't offer you Financial Services Compensation Scheme. What we do believe we also offer is very highly competitive rates of interest and good flexibility to support our churches, because that's what we consider ourselves here to do. I will just let Neil talk quickly about what CAF offer.
I'll try and be succinct here. Apologies, it's small fonts here. So what we tend to look at from any of our clients' perspective is the continuum of their money from the instant access through to long term. And what this position and on this screen takes you through is from CAF cash accounts. So that's your instant access. Gold, which is 0.15. Let's be honest, it's not a particularly great return, so therefore the desire is to move it elsewhere. So it's important to note from our perspective, we then enter into the world of what we call CAF Financial Solutions Limited. To cut a very long story short, that is our entity that enables us to approach third-party providers under the CAF banner to drive a better rate of return than those third-party providers would give direct. So in this instance, Richard, what we've managed to achieve from Shawbrook and Scottish Widows was a case of, well, actually, we're here for the mission of delivering in this sector. What can you provide that you wouldn't provide direct? So those are now positioned out. Scottish Widows, you'll see a big differential between their 12-month position and Shawbrook. The answer to the reason is there's such a big differential is quite bluntly Scottish Widows at the moment just have too much money, and it's reflected in the rate that they're putting out to the market.
And there are different profiles for those banks, because Scottish Widows are part of the Lloyds banking group.
Absolutely.
And they're one of the more secure banks in the UK. Shawbrook are a bit of a newer entity and therefore trying to attract money in. So they're offering more attractive rates.
And it comes back to finding the right person for the right relationship. On the far right hand side, the CAF Charity Deposit Platform. This is a really interesting new development which we've just launched and goes in terms of formal launch any day now. But essentially what that provides the client with is a platform, a one-line opening of the account. So in other words, from an AML, anti-money laundering and KYC positioning, once that charity or church is on, the AML has been cleared, and it enables you then to purchase the products that sit on that platform. So typically at the moment, there's around 100 accounts across around 25 building societies and banks. I pulled off the rates this morning to give you a kind of idea. So they're ranging at the moment up to around 1.8 under a 95-day notice, and 12 months is in that region, 1.65. It depends on the entity. Exciting times. Have a look out. It may suit you to go on a platform approach. Happy to answer any questions.
But you need to be looking at reasonable sums of money. I think you've got 50,000 plus.
Yeah, it's a classic actually. When you enter the smaller amounts of money, the work involved is probably not worth the returns. Yeah.
Okay. So just moving on, and we've talked about savings. Now talking about borrowing. So borrowing is a relatively straightforward beast in some sense. You've got to think about the interest rate that you're going to pay. You've got to think about the term, as in how long you're going to pay it back over, what fees and charges there might be, and what security you're offering. So most lending to churches will be secured against a property, and you'll certainly pay a higher rate if it's not, because the bank will look at its chances of getting its money, or the lender will look at its chances of getting the money back, and it will feel more comfortable if there is some security that it can take possession of if it needs to foreclose on the loan. And you might need to think about how your project that you're borrowing for, again, usually building projects, how the borrowing would work in terms of tranches and project stages. Potentially, do they need interim valuations of anything you're building? It depends very much on the type of borrowing you're doing. If it's borrowing to buy a manse that already exists, then that may become less relevant. But if you're borrowing to build a new church building, which we know some people do, and the security is against the church building, the lender will want to know that the building is still offering good security through the life of that project, and that can get quite expensive. So there can be quite substantial fees for doing interim valuations of a part-built property. And there's also things about flexibility on repayment. So often churches will have a gift day. We do see, certainly the loans that we make here, it's quite common for a church to pay back faster than they originally anticipated. And or they might get a gift or a legacy or whatever, and they want to be able to pay back early. Some borrowers will charge you for that. So I talked just briefly about our proposition, but we've got, as Baptist Together, we've got just shy of £40 million out on loan now. So we've got those quite a lot of that lent to churches. So there's about getting on for half of that lent to about 120 different churches across the union. So that's great, and some of them are using them to have purchased a manse, some for doing work on their church, some to pay off pension deficits. We've got a chunk of money used to finance retired ministers' housing with Retired Baptist Ministers' Housing Organisation, and then some others, most of which is with our colleges. This slide's a little out of date. We've got a little bit more lent now, but it's about as correct as of about 3 or 4 months ago. And we offer terms, standard loans up to £1 million. We have gone up to £2 million on occasion for when a church or other entity is looking for larger sums of money. And our standard interest rate is 3% above the Bank of England base rate, and repayment terms between 10 and 20 years usually. We tend to try to counsel churches to avoid very long-term loan commitments, because we view the idea that a church 15 years down the line might be quite a different animal from what it is today. Churches go through life cycles, a new minister, new people, and burdening the future generation with a loan from something that's already been historic. It's just something you've got to think through. So we would ask you to think about that sort of issue. And actually, one of the big advantages we offer is our loans are fee-free. We don't really charge substantial fees at all in terms of application or any such. We sometimes pass on direct costs that we have to face in terms of putting charges on property or the like, but even then that often isn't needed if the property is held in trust with us. So that's one of the options. There's also, it's worth noting, the Baptist Building Fund will loan interest free, I believe currently up to £250,000. That's a separate charitable body from the union and separately governed, but you may find them suitable for your needs if it's a small project. But then there is the public banking market and CAF, for example.
Yeah, I mean, certainly from the offering available, Richard, I mean, it's a very compelling proposition, absolutely, and something that should certainly be entertained. From our perspective, we're kind of split into two. We have CAF Bank and CAF Venturesome. And for ease, if you consider the secured loans on the slide here is by CAF Bank, and CAF Venturesome provides social investment. In essence, what we've been seeing with the churches that we have lent money to, you're absolutely right. Every fantastic kind of development through from renovating and buying a full kit out of a new property, but all the way through to some tremendous sort of community cafes that have been attached. One particularly on the outskirts of Liverpool, but we've got a big church down in Bristol that created a terrific auditorium for the congregation, but also potential for corporates to use. So real sort of social drive. From a CAF Bank point of view, the reason we go to 25 years is because part of our market extends beyond churches into housing associations.
No,
interesting, I think, Richard, you make an excellent point. We're real believers in we will only make sure we lend money in the appropriate manner. What I mean by that is if we do not believe that charity should be taking the money over 25 years, we will very happily say so. It's not right to burden a charity with terms that just do not fit. And there is always the ability to review. Repayment, just to clarify from a bank perspective, often the reason there are what they call early repayment penalties is usually because the rate that they've achieved in the market is beholden and therefore beyond a 1 or 2 year position. It allows that bank to say, well, we've covered those costs, so therefore repayment, yes, we're happy with. Social investment, CAF Venturesome, the best way of explaining that is to think that the loans are driven not out of a bank account balance sheet, but from philanthropists, companies who are seeking to do good with their money. So funds are created with the intention to drive huge, high social impact. But there is very much a risk that those loans may never get repaid. So it's fundamentally different from a CAF Bank or indeed a high street bank proposition.
Sorry. No, indeed, that's obviously a different type of model. I would just say we're coming towards the end of our slides now, but if you have any questions on anything we've talked about or anything you think we should have talked about, then please do submit them via the Q&A panel. We're just going to come on, we're not going to spend too much time with two final topics we're going to cover, which is investments and insurance. So just talk.
Yeah, I'll take a whistle-stop tour through investments. Let's bear in mind Warren Buffett. He's got a terrific quote where he basically says, don't consider investing in something for 10 minutes that you wouldn't consider for 10 years. Now, that's taking the extremes, but it's a very good sort of mantra to be aware this is a long-term play. So key considerations, there's some terrific stuff under CC14, gives you some really good pointers, steer, guidance. And you must make sure that you adhere to that from a trustee positioning, as well as the charity and the church. So why invest? Well, clearly there is the desire for a long-term strategy to maximise what you can, and they can be blended from everything from pure income generation to capital growth, or indeed a blend of those as you move forward.
Yeah. And we're aware of churches that have had a substantial, say, legacy in the past and invested it and use that in the income on that capital to fund live parts of their operation or to fund mission projects or what have you. So there's nothing necessarily wrong with making investments, and I guess some people would see it potentially as hoarding money, but there are, if it's part of the appropriate financial strategy for your church, then it can be absolutely correct.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. You often get a lot of noise, particularly in when the press are feeling particularly negative about anyone holding money. But let's be honest, good business holds money to do good for the longer term. So I'm a real advocate for a properly structured investment positioning. Let's be very, very mindful of the advice position. As trustees, as people responsible for others' money, congregational money, there is that heightened awareness of, I need to make sure this is done in the right way. To give an example, very quickly, we entertained a position from a church where we actually found that an individual suggested they were a regulated investment advisor within the church, which they were not. Warning signs there. So very much think about advice and who's best positioned to do that.
And you, because investments, you have the risk of losing money in a way that is certainly less so in banks. Deposit with a bank. You do need to be careful to ensure that any risks you're taking are well understood and are appropriate to your organisation. Obviously, the returns potential is much higher in investments there, but it's a much higher risk than anything we've talked about before.
I won't necessarily go into all of the details because there are things like asset classes, and do you look at property funds, and do you look at ethical and etc. But they're all things that you want to consider. But on this particular slide, actually, as with borrowing, be very careful that you do have the powers to borrow and the powers to invest. I genuinely have had charities where we're at the 11th hour and it's realised their constitution, their governance, their policies do not enable them to invest. And there's a lot of work being put in to suddenly find you don't have that position.
Yeah, do check your constitutional document to see if you've got this power. I believe both the standard approved governing documents that we publish give you the ability to make investments and to borrow. But yes, some charity governance documents will not allow that.
Absolutely not. And then very briefly, we'll just touch upon some other key considerations. I mentioned there about an advisor or self-managed. Without doubt, there will be those that have the ability to self-manage. Possibly they've come from an IFA background, a fund management house, and there's nothing wrong with that. But make sure you've played the critical friend and challenged. Are we really best placed, and do we want to accept that liability? There are platforms. The best way of explaining what a platform is, a little bit like the charity deposit platform I mentioned earlier. This is essentially a place where it enables you to trade, buy, sell, and it provides lots of additional functionality, reporting, dual authorization, which we have on the CAF investment account. The best advice I would say there is take some advice on the things you're looking at. And ask the questions and get the questions answered. Because
you can have a platform, but then you have an advisor advising you on the appropriate investments to buy through that platform. They're not necessarily tied together at all.
No.
Although some advisors will prefer certain platforms and vice versa. But you will need a mechanism to buy through, and often a platform investment is a good way of doing that, or investment platform is a good way of doing that.
Very briefly, I think if we look at leave the top one for the moment, because that's the investment account. The bottom four are essentially all white labelled funds that CAF has, some ranging from ethical positioning to trackers, etc. The top bullet point there, the investment account, that is the one-stop online account that enables you to trade. I would very much suggest adopt your strategy and policy, then go to seek the best solutions for you and your desired and the capabilities. Do you really want to embrace that? So there's a range of options, clearly. Very happy to talk about it. CAF doesn't provide advice. We have access to people that do, but it's a world to give some consideration to.
I think if you are looking at this, then do think carefully about what you're doing and read CC14, the Charity Commission guidance up for trustees on investments, and then you will need to get an advisor involved. Finally, the final topic we're going to cover is just insurance. There are lots of types of insurance. For your building, for your manse, for public liability, so that's damage you might cause to the members of the public or other people's property, employers' liability, so harming your employees, which can include Employees liability usually covers volunteers and usually covers trustees. Any harm done to a trustee or a member of staff, which includes a minister. I know the employer word, people can think it excludes, but it can include all of those. Trustee liability, that's trustee's liability for any mistakes the trustee may make, albeit a claim to have made. Legal expenses, loss of income. For example, if you've got say for example a cafe and there's a flood and you can't run the cafe and that was critical to you, you may need to insure that income. There's also newer areas of insurance like cyber risk, for example, the risk of having your website hacked or your data stolen. So there are lots of different types of insurance. It's really important to think obviously about the price. You don't want to overpay for your insurance. You want to think very carefully about the level of excess. So you can change the price quite a lot by having a different excess. It's probably not wise, for example, to have an excess of £5 because the insurer will assume you'll be claiming all the time. But if you have an excess of £50,000, well, you may never actually be able to claim because you can't pay the first £50,000 of a claim anyway. So just think about what's the right level for you. I would generally say the level of excess should be set at the amount you were reasonably comfortable that you could cover from your own resources if there was something to happen. So for example, at the union, we pick generally have an excess of £10,000. We will go, you may think that's too high for your church, but an excess of a very low excess, you will pay a premium for. Think about the customer service. Do you feel comfortable that you're going to get your claims paid? You only really know how good your insurance is when you try to claim on it. And does your insurance understand church needs? In some of these categories I've talked about on the left-hand side, there are some very particular ways that churches have risks. So running a faith, running a youth club, running letting your building to other parties. These are all things that are not unique to churches, but are more common in churches. And you just need to think very carefully about does the insurance I'm getting really cover what my church actually does? So, as a general rule, we would suggest strongly that churches consider specialist insurers in this space. Baptist insurance has been around a long time and is very focused on what the needs of Baptist churches are. So I would recommend that you consider them. I'm not formally recommending their product, but they do have a product that is very well configured for Baptist churches. There are other insurers out there, and I'm aware that some churches have chosen other insurers for various things. But you, as I say, be very aware of, does my insurer really understand what we do? Because if they insure your activities, they really need to feel comfortable with the activities that you've got, and how they match. Because if you try to make a claim and they feel you were doing something that was beyond the scope of what they were insuring, then you may well never get the payout, and that can be very, very high risk. Because in a potentially litigious society, some of the liabilities you can incur can be very large, and you wouldn't want those falling on your trustees if you can avoid it. Some final thoughts. Churches are different. We've talked about that quite a lot. The needs are distinct. We haven't really covered things like wills, testaments and trusts, but you might want to think about that. We do have a will scheme within the union if you want to look up that. That's baptist.org.uk/legacy. There are more limited product sets available to churches than you would expect from a small business perspective, for example. And it can take some research to find the right fit for you. One thing I would say is just network with other churches. You will often find that the problem you're facing is not unique to you, and other church treasurers will have faced the same problem and found a solution sometimes. Or they may just tell you there isn't a solution, I've looked very hard, don't bother looking again. But that can save you a lot of time. So do try to network with your local churches, and do feel free to drop us a line at the support services team if you think we might be able to help you. Just as a final thing, just here are some contact details if you do want to get in touch with us. So The Support Services team email address and phone is up there, and the CAF's contact details are up there if you've got anything you want to query us on. We have run quite long. I actually haven't seen very many questions coming through, so I think we've run slightly over time. Apologies for that if you've stuck with us. We hope it's been an interesting webinar for you. If you have any questions that come out of it, our email addresses are there. I do want to thank Neil for his time.
Thanks, Richard. You're welcome.
And thank you to CAF for releasing you to do this with us. As I say, if you want to talk to CAF about any of their specific products, you've got the contact details there. And we look forward to welcoming you to our future webinars. If you do have a topic that you would like to see covered in a webinar, then do contact us on the email address there. We try to think of things that we believe churches will find interesting, but it's always helpful if you give us a few clues as to what you would be looking for. And all our previous webinar recordings are available. baptist.org.uk/webinars holds all of those, and we've got a bit of a library building that you can then rewatch. We will be publishing this webinar onto that page in the next few days, and alongside that the slides from this webinar. So thank you very much for your time. Thank you, Neil.
Thanks, Richard.
And it's been a pleasure for us. I hope it's been interesting for you, and we look forward to seeing you again on a future webinar. Thank you very much.